Okay. So thanks for joining, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Children and Young People Active Lives Survey, and these are the results from the most recent academic year. So it's last year, the last full academic year, and we'll be talking about the results for Somerset. If you have any questions throughout, then please feel free to raise your hand and ask as you go along, or you can also put it in the chat if you've got any questions. There'll also be a bit of time at the end for a bit of discussion if people would like to talk. So the Active Lives Children and Young People Survey looks at data for children and young people in school years from 1 to 11, and so that's children aged 5 to 16 across England. The first survey was in the academic year 2017-18. So today we're going to be covering all the way from then up until the last full academic year. All of the data for all of those academic years can be found on the Sport England website at a national level. And then at a more local level, we kind of hold that and have presentations on that, so we can share that if you'd like to know more. We will be looking at the latest academic year, 2021-2022. In terms of what was going on in that year, COVID still was a bit around. There was kind of some limited restrictions due to Omicron, but it was very much kind of back to normal across most of the county. Just a bit of a caution on sample size. So the sample size has fallen since 2017-18 when it was around 2,500. But we have seen an increase in sample size from last year. So we're around 1,168, which is about 25% higher than it was last year. But what this means in terms of sub-analysis, it means we've got a bit of a limitation on what we can sub-analyse. And the biggest restriction really is on location. So prior to us going unitary, we kind of had those 4 local authority areas, and we would like to be able to look at the data across those 4 areas, but unfortunately one of those areas doesn't have enough data for us to be able to do that. So it's just a bit of a caution really on that. What is good to know though is that Sport England are looking at doing some estimates of small area estimates for Active Lives Survey, and those things are coming in the future. So we will have more information and more data on a more local level coming soon, hopefully, which I will also share with everyone. So in terms of what we mean by activity, so sport and physical activity is kind of anything really that we're doing that is at least moderate intensity. It can be dance, it can be active play, it can be walking, it can be scooting. So it's a real mix of things for children and young people. And there's different definitions given from the government guidance about being active for a child. And so you're defined as active if you've done at least 60 minutes a day, fairly active if you do between half an hour and 60 minutes, and inactive if you do less than half an hour a day. And government guidelines recommend that children and young people should get about half of that at school during their school day and half of it outside of their school day. So it should be kind of 50-50. So I'm just going to move on to the key findings. So the key findings across Somerset are that we've really seen a good recovery in activity levels to pre-pandemic levels. So we are seeing that children's activity levels are improving, particularly since the last 2 years and COVID. We, however, are seeing that there is inequality in the recovery. So not everyone is recovering as well as we would hope. And some of those things I'm going to be talking about in a bit more detail. And we're also seeing that mental wellbeing and physical literacy is really important at this age, particularly for young children, to help them improve their activity levels. It's really about making children feel good and feel like they're having fun and a good positive experience to help them be active in the first place, but also continue to be active as they get older. So if we go into some of these findings in a bit more detail, so as I said before, children's activity levels have recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And what we're seeing in Somerset is that we've got over 50% now of children and young people who are active and that they do more than 60 minutes a day. So we are the purple boxes and the grey boxes are in England. So we've actually got a higher proportion of children and people who are active than we're seeing in England, which is 47.2%. We have also seen a fall in those who are inactive. So we've got less than a quarter now who are inactive, whereas across England we see 3 in 10 people are active. These figures, they're encouraging and they're a step in the right direction, but they also kind of show us that there's still 50% of children who are either inactive or fairly active. So we're still seeing around 50% of children who are not active. So there's still much more to do to make as many children as possible feel the benefits of being active. But as you can see here, this is kind of the trend that's been going on across Somerset over the years. And we are again in purple, so the dark purple is active and the light purple is inactive. And as you can see, our percentage that are active, as we kind of felt the effects of COVID a lot more than nationally. We saw quite a huge drop in 2020, 2021, but we are seeing a recovery from that now, and we're kind of back at our 2018, 2019 figures. No, we're not quite back to we're not quite back to 2020, 2019, 2020, but we are getting there. We're kind of, looks like we're going in the right direction. And we kind of have overtaken really the national average on that. And as you can see as well, for inactive, we have seen a huge drop in those that are inactive. So we're not just getting people active, but we're moving people out of being inactive, which is really encouraging. What I would say is that activity levels do differ across demographics. And here I'm going to kind of do a bit of a summary, and then I'm going to go into a bit more detail about what's going on for those in terms of inequalities that we see might exist. So there is a real difference across year groups. So what I would just say here to caveat these figures are the way that the Children and Young People Active Life Survey, the data is collected, schools are sampled by Sport England, and then they do the survey. They're selected for a certain term and they are selected for a certain year group. So some of these, there might be like a small number of schools that contribute to some of these year groups. So that's just a caveat to this, but that's something that we see across the board. But what we are seeing is that those children aged in the years 3 to 4, so they're aged 7 to 9, have got the lowest activity levels. So only 39.6% of those are active. And that is something that we've seen nationally as well. So that's not just a Somerset thing, that's a national picture that's going on for that for those year groups. We're also seeing a real peak in the secondary school years. So we're seeing 2/3 of children in kind of the early secondary school years, 7 to 8, are active, and over 50% now for years 9 to 11. So we are seeing a bit of a mix really across year groups, and that's something I'll go into a bit more detail in a bit. A big thing to come out of the survey this year is that boys are more likely to be active than girls. This is a trend that we have seen in the past, but that got completely changed during COVID, and girls became more active than boys. But what we are seeing is that that trend is reversed back to boys being more active than girls, and the gap is now relatively big. It's around 8 percentage points, so it has kind of increased quite a lot. And again, I'll talk about that in a bit. Family affluence, so how affluent different families are. We've got low, medium and high, and as you can see there, the more affluent you are, the more likely you are to be active. So 57.1% of those who are high affluence are active, whereas only 37.2% of low affluence are active. I'll go into a bit more detail in a bit, but that gap has got bigger, and that's something that we really need to think about and consider. And then what's interesting here for disability is that activity levels among children and young people with a disability or long-term health condition are the same for those without one. So we're seeing very similar figures here for those with a disability versus those without a disability. What I would just say for the figures around disability is they're relatively low figures for those who have got a disability or long-term limiting health condition. And so it's definitely worth thinking about in the future when we think about the schools that have been selected, about how we might kind of increase those figures so we get more robust figures for those. So there's also been a notable recovery across some key activities. So during COVID, we did see quite a big impact on a lot of different activities, particularly team sports, which has always been very popular for children and young people, fell really low. Swimming fell low because obviously the pools closed, and walking went high and then kind of fell a bit. But now what we're seeing is pretty much most of those have gone kind of back up again, and actually active play has become extremely popular, with almost 3/4 of children and young people doing those activities. We've also seen team sports kind of recover a bit, but they haven't quite got back to where they were before. So they're not quite back to the 60% kind of figures there, but they are kind of moving in the right direction. And walking again has bounced back. What I would say is that the swimming figures look really, really high for this year. I'll go into a bit more detail about why that might be. So I just be cautious on those swimming figures, and please do take those with a bit of a pinch of salt. Going on a bike ride has stayed relatively stable across the years, and across all of the age groups as well. So now I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that the overall picture looks pretty good, and that, you know, over 50% of children and young people are active in Somerset. We're doing better than the national average, but we are seeing inequality in this recovery, and this is something I think we really want to understand and focus on as across Somerset. So girls have not recovered as well as boys, is one of the key findings that we have. So boys, as you can see here, really suffered the effects of COVID, and they really fell quite dramatically in 2019, 2020 and 2021. And a lot of that was around the types of activities that boys were doing. So for example, team sports, a lot of those things were halted or were restricted. But we've seen a huge recovery for boys this year, this last academic year, and it's increased by, you know, over around 12 percentage points. So they really have been driving the recovery across Somerset for children and young people activity levels. Whereas as you can see for girls, the story is quite different. They actually became more active the first kind of part of COVID, switching to kind of online things at home. But then they kind of fell off a bit as we kind of came out of that in 2020, 2021. And then this last academic year, they've kind of stabilised at that level, which if you look back to 2018, 19, it's very similar figures. They've kind of almost gone back to normal, and they haven't seen the same increase that the boys have seen. What I would say is this is something that we're seeing nationally as well. So this is something that is happening across the board, and it's not just something we're seeing in Somerset. It is something that we're seeing across all of England. And as you can see here, inactive, we're seeing a lot fewer boys being inactive, which is great. We've now got the lowest percentage that we've ever seen for boys being inactive. So that's really great news for the boys. And we did actually see a fall in the girls being inactive this academic year as well. So that fell by about 4 percentage points. So we did see some of those girls that were inactive, they've moved to the fairly active, but they haven't quite got to active yet. So they are moving up. There's not many of them, but they are moving up. They just haven't quite got to the active point yet. But again, we're kind of getting to those figures of inactive girls being quite low, and it's the second lowest we've seen for girls being inactive. What I would say is that there is a particular age group where we saw quite a huge increase for girls, and that was in years 9 to 11. So it's the older teenage girls that we saw a huge jump in activity levels. So we saw around 70% of girls in those years now being active. So that is one of those positive stories that we're seeing, is that whilst we are seeing across the board girls kind of remaining stable across active, there are pockets of girls that are becoming more active, and those are those teenage girls. We're also seeing that for boys as well, that a lot of the recovery was in those teenage years. So it's the secondary schools that we're seeing a lot of increases in activity. Boys, it was a higher proportion of the younger years, so years 7 to 8. And girls, it was the older teenage years, 9 to 11. Again, what I would say is that this is not just a Somerset thing. This is something that we're seeing nationally. So it's really interesting to think about why that might be. Some of the national figures, it's kind of around the whole football and the Euros, but also around some of the This Girl Can campaigns being more focused on kind of teenagers, and thinking about the older teenagers as they transition to adults. The next inequality and recovery that we've seen is that lower affluent families are still less likely to be active than those from higher affluence. So here we've got a graph across the different affluent levels. So the dark purple, the kind of top line when you look at 21, 22 is the most affluent. The middle line is mid-affluent, and then least affluent is the pale purple. And what we're seeing is that in the last year, the gap between those who are least affluent and most affluent has gotten bigger in terms of those who are active. So despite the fact that we saw an increase in those who are being active who are least affluent from 33.8% to 37.2%, we saw an even greater jump for those who are most affluent. There's a 10 percentage point jump there for those. And so it's just made the gap even bigger. So last year, this gap was around 14 percentage points, but this year this is around 20 percentage points. So we're seeing a huge widening gap really between children who are living in lower affluent families are kind of lagging behind those who are living in more affluent families. This is something that we are seeing across the board. It's something that there's a lot of context around. So, for example, the cost of living crisis, not being able to afford kind of that what some people see as extras to be doing physical activity outside of school. And so it's really something to be thinking about. I think it's something that we don't want to continue in the future. We do not want this gap to be getting bigger. So it's something we really need to think about in terms of what we do there. What we are also seeing is that nationally we are seeing something similar, but actually our case in Somerset is a bit more extreme than what we're seeing nationally. So our most affluent families are more active than the national average of affluent families, and our least affluent families are less active than the national average. So our gap is bigger than the national gap. So it's just something to think about, is that we're seeing a bit more of an extreme case than we are seeing nationally. And we're also seeing that they're less likely to say they've got positive attitudes towards sport and physical activity. And that's something that we'll kind of look into in a bit around kind of positive experiences and well-being as well. So as I said before, when I was looking at the girls, there's quite a big increase in activity levels for secondary school children. But what we have seen is that some primary children have struggled to get back to those pre-pandemic levels. So here we're looking across both boys and girls. This is all children, and we're looking at the different year groups. So secondaries on the right, and infant and juniors kind of in the middle. And what we've seen is that activity by year groups has always been a bit volatile, particularly during the pandemic. there's a bit of an unexplained spike going on for years 1 to 2 in 2019-20, where it kind of went up to 75%. But what we have seen is that there's been like noticeable increases for those in secondary age. And as I showed you before, that's driven by both boys and by girls. But actually at primary school age, we're not seeing as much as a recovery as we are in secondary school. And we're seeing the lowest rates really for those years 3 to 4, as I mentioned earlier. So they're age 7 to 9. So it's thinking about what's going on for those children. They have increased the proportion that are active, but they just haven't quite increased as much. We've also seen those in years 5 to 6. It's been pretty stable across the years. They don't seem to have been as impacted by COVID. They've actually slightly fallen this last year, but it's not a significant fall. So it's kind of like they're on the same level as they were last year. So again, it's just something to think about in terms of age and year group, that we're not seeing a universal recovery across all the different school years at the moment. And then I just wanted to give a bit of context and information on the swimming figures. So swimming levels, we've seen a significant increase compared to 12 months ago. However, we really need to be cautious about those figures because they have increased so much. So as you can see here, the dark blue one is swimming, and you can see the jump, it's over double what it was the year before. So we've seen a huge increase from 16.1% to 38.1%. And this increase is almost double the national increase. So nationally it had about a 12 percentage point increase, and we're seeing over double that. However, it's just important to note that the data is really reliant on which schools have been selected in the sample and their access to pools. So it might be the case that some of the schools have better infrastructure or access to swimming than one that was selected in the year before. The year before also we saw a huge impact of COVID as well. So it's really just thinking about that's what happens when we have a sample of the schools, and some schools might have better access than others. It also might be related to affluence. We might find that we have some schools that are in more affluent areas, and that might shift the results as well. So I think this really kind of might tie into us thinking about what else we might do to find out more about swimming for children and young people across Somerset, and that the Active Life Survey is one way to do this, but there might be other more appropriate ways really to hear about how children are interacting with swimming across Somerset. But just to note on what we're seeing across the figures, so we are seeing that impact of family affluence again. It's even kind of greater than you see just for activity levels. Only 35% of those who come from a low affluent family can swim 25 metres unaided, whereas it's almost 2/3 of those who come from a high affluent family. And it's primarily down to the cost of swimming, particularly if you're taking your children swimming before they go to school and before it's in the curriculum. And also we're unsurprisingly seeing a link between age and ability to swim. As you get older, you're more likely to be able to swim that 25 metres. So I'm just moving on to mental health and physical literacy, and nationally the survey provides evidence of benefits of getting active for mental health, with more children and young people getting active to help their mental well-being. And they saw a significant increase in the proportion of those exercising to relax and worry less, and socially for fun with their friends. And those higher activity levels continue to have higher levels of well-being. Active children and young people are more likely to be happy and less likely to feel lonely often or always than they are those who are less active. And what we are seeing though is that physical literacy levels have not recovered quite to the same extent as others. So physical literacy is the foundation for movement, we measure it by a number of different positive attitudes that children have towards sport and physical activity. So things like competence, understanding, enjoyment, confidence, and knowledge. So those words in quotes are what's asked of the children in this survey. So they say, I find sport easy, and they answer it between 1 and 10, to the extent to which they find it easy. What we have found is that, and this is in line with national trends, is that Somerset continues to see fewer children reporting each of those positive attitudes, and they haven't recovered to pre-pandemic rates. Since there's been noticeable decreases, particularly in understanding and knowledge. So knowledge is only asked for secondary school children, with a decrease of 19% from 2020 to 2021. But it's interesting to think about that in terms of what we saw for the figures for those years, that a lot of those improved quite well for the teenage years. It's thinking about how this all fits in together. But also what we do know is that physically literate children are more likely to be active and have high levels of well-being. So it really is vital to focus on providing positive experiences with fun and choice offered, and children involved in the decisions around design and delivery. In terms of well-being, overall the levels of well-being for children and young people are still down across England and across Somerset. There's a lot kind of to do with cost of living pressures, young people still bearing the brunt of COVID, and so supporting children and young people to be active is really important at the moment, particularly for that well-being side of things. Nationally, they're seeing a link between mental well-being scores being higher for those who are active and those who are less active. What I would say is we haven't seen a similar link at the moment in Somerset, and that what we're seeing is that well-being and the mental health figures is kind of very similar figures for those who are less active versus those that are active. I think it's just important to note again around sampling and the figures, and when we get to more detail, when we're kind of looking at two different figures mixed together, so activity levels and mental well-being, we're getting down to quite small sample sizes, and that's one of the reasons why we might not be seeing a similar trend as we're seeing across the nation. But it's just something to think about and consider in the future, is those things around physical literacy and mental well-being, that it's not just all around the physical benefits of being physically active, but also the mental benefits too. So what does this all mean for us? So now I'm just going to talk through a couple of slides about what these findings mean for us in Somerset, and what we might want to do with those findings. So one of the key findings we found is that there's inequality in recovery across gender, affluence and age. So the figures are an encouraging step in the right direction, but it is really a reminder that there's so much more to do to make sure as many children as possible feel the benefits of being active. So our role is really to think about, so what and what next? What can we do? So we, as a kind of organisation at SAS, but also wider than that as a system in Somerset, we really want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get active. And so some of the things that we're already doing, some of the things to address things like gender difference and affluence. So for example, HAF and warm spaces and swimming, we're doing a lot of work with to kind of help improve opportunity for people who are lower affluent. But there is also things that we might want to be thinking about as to how we might support these groups and try to break down those barriers to getting active. So think about what other things could we be doing, or what other things could we be focusing to help support those different groups and break down those barriers to be active. And then, as we said before, mental wellbeing and physical literacy are key to being active. And a lot of that is around positive experiences for children and young people. A lot of children and young people, if they experience something positive around physical activity, particularly at a really young age, it can really help to shape their attitude to physical activity for life. And it's almost about kind of capturing them early and capturing the essence of physical activity early so that they can continue that throughout their life. So how do we continue to ensure there is this focus on providing positive experiences and children involved in these decisions around design and delivery? We're designing things for them that they would enjoy, they would have fun doing, and that they would want to experience. So I'm going to pause there, and I was hoping to finish at around 11:45, so that gives around 10 or so minutes for any questions or discussion that anyone has. So yeah, feel free to ask any questions. Jane. Oh, John, you've got your hand up first.
Yeah, so on that one, obviously you said the size of the sample was just under 1,200. Is that purposeful, or is that just all the ones that replied?
So what do you mean by purposeful in your question?
Because you said you select schools. Again, is that all you selected for it? Is obviously, so the data set that you were sort of presenting there is a very small proportion of something. I don't know how many children are in Somerset in that age group. It's probably about 30,000, I can imagine. So that's obviously a tiny percentage of that. And if it, like you said, the swimming one skewed because potentially you asked the children that got a swimming pool right next to the school. So again, is there any ways to actually increase the sample size to actually get a picture, a fuller picture, should we say?
Yeah, so how it's done is that Sport England randomly selects schools, and they do them each term of an academic year. So we get a list of schools from Sport England that they've randomly selected for the autumn term, for the spring term and the summer term. And then we go out there and encourage schools to complete the surveys for those year groups that they've been selected for in those terms. And completely agree that it's relatively small versus the whole number of children and young people that are across Somerset. What we have been doing this year to encourage greater participation by schools is that we've been working more with the SGOs and the school games organisers. We've been doing a bit more of a plan around marketing and kind of building relationships with the schools to encourage them to take part. It is quite a big survey, so it can be quite difficult to get schools taking part, but we are encouraging them as much as possible. And we have seen an increase again in the sample this year, so it's already higher than last year, even though we haven't finished the school year yet. So it's really around encouraging schools to take part, but we don't have control over who's in the random sample. That's Sport England that selects those, but schools can opt in if they would like to. So we do also try to encourage schools to opt in to take part as well. So yeah, it's basically helping schools to encourage them to take part, to get the children to fill in the surveys. So yeah, we're working on improving that sample size as much as possible. I hope that answers your question, John.
Yeah, it just seems, say to me, I'm not quite sure why Sport England only select a few schools to do it when surely I know I used to work at the schools partnership. Every year we did a survey. Yes, it was a pain, but equally you had the data then to deliver. Now there's very limited data out there at the moment to support it. I know the percentages could be a heck of a lot higher, or they could be a heck of a lot lower, and it just seems a really sort of scattergun approach, or something that's sort of really important to trying to get, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think yeah, it would be great if they would just get everyone to do it. It would be great if we got those figures. I'm pretty sure it's probably down to cost as one of the main things from their side. I don't know, Jake, if you have anything to add on the Sport England.
I think, yeah, it probably is down to cost is the main driver. I think we can have additional schools added though, can't we, in terms of so if for example they select a certain sample of schools, and we want to kind of increase that or change the schools, then we've got the options to do that. But yeah, I agree. I think ultimately with this and with any survey of physical activity, the bigger sample size you've got, the better. Yeah, because it gives you a more robust picture.
Yes. Jane, you had your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I joined a little bit late. So I joined at the inequality graph,
Okay.
which is fortuitous for me. So obviously we see a gap in Somerset, which is widening at a greater rate. And I suppose I'm interested whether it looked the same pre-pandemic, and that and the bit of the graph where those who are least affluent, I think in 1920, I wrote down, but it might be in 20, I think 1920, sort of got up. Was that a blip in the data? Because I know that we do get blips in the data, or was that something that, so there were quite a lot of questions there, Annabelle.
So your first question was around what we're seeing now. Is that what we saw before the pandemic?
Yeah, and yeah, I get that it might have widened a bit, but is that what we kind of saw? But
yeah, so prior to the pandemic, so 2018-19, we did see a gap between those who are from least affluent families to most affluent families, and that gap was pretty big, and it got bigger from the previous year, so it was widening. It's even bigger now, though, I guess is the main thing. It's probably 4 or 5 percentage points bigger now, so it's bigger than it was back before pre-pandemic levels. And we did see those from least affluent families kind of even out during COVID. They were basically, affluence didn't really matter during that year of COVID, 2019-2020. There's a couple of things going on there. A lot of the paid for activities didn't exist because COVID kind of stripped them out and they weren't going on. And so a lot of things that people were doing were free things because there was nothing else they could be doing. So activity at home, walking, getting outside, going to the park when they were able to, when the restrictions allowed. You couldn't actually go and do any paid for activities. So it kind of evened the playing field a bit, almost in like a kind of weird way. And then I think what we're seeing now, as we see 2020 onwards, is that those paid for activities are coming back, and we're back at school and things like that. And so actually, and the schools are open, so actually those things outside of school are now all pretty much paid for things, or a lot more of them are. And so that gap has widened again. I think that's kind of what the kind of story that's going on really for those groups.
We just saw such a huge drop
from
and we can say we leveled the playing field, but obviously nobody stayed doing the free stuff. And it's interesting, it would be interesting to know why nobody stayed doing that. I'm trying to work out the narrative in my head, so and how we investigate some of that. So yeah, so I was interested in why the 1920 bit has disappeared into a trough.
Yeah.
Now that was all. So thank you.
That's right. Jake, you had your hand.
Yeah, so on the big increase for girls in years 9 to 11, I think it was.
Yeah.
Have we got any, can we cut the data to find out what activities they would have done? Because I think for me, it's such a big increase, and overall the difference is quite large between girls and boys. So actually, I'd be interested to know what made up that increase in terms of activity wise, because I think that will give you a good indication of overall activities, girls and boys. Because I think my observation, it's interesting that gap closed down due to COVID, and I think girls basically almost overtook boys in terms of physical activity in COVID. And a lot of that was the fact that boys get most of their activity from club and team sport, and none of that happened during COVID. And girls got most of their activity from online activities during COVID. So I think that tells us a lot around where people get their activity from in relation to boys and girls. So it'd just be interesting to drill down into that particular age group because it's had a big increase.
Yeah, and that's definitely something we can do. We can look at it by age group and by what type of activity they've been doing. I think they looked at it on a national picture, and a lot of it was around football, but it's not something we've had a look at yet locally, so we don't know whether it is related to football or if it's if it's something else. Yeah, it's definitely something we can explore. Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts before we finish? John, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Sorry, my camera's not working.
That's all right.
Just sort of what other sort of plans are in place to try and certainly reduce the inequality, as Jane said, but equally talking to schools at the moment, they're struggling with the cost of swimming, for example, and they're looking to reduce what they're doing. And that's certainly the case with quite a few schools in quite a few areas. Is that, I don't know, more opportunities can be put through sort of SASP and the development plan and things like that to increase some of these elements?
I will hand over to Jane or Jake. If you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to start initially on that one. I think it's fair to say I would agree with you, John, is speaking to people like Jane and the other SGOs on the call, is a lot of the intelligence that we're getting from schools is that they're actually reducing down their swimming due to the cost of hiring pools, having staff that are qualified. I think so the actual survey data, and I think when I initially saw this, I was quite surprised in terms of the swimming, and I think it's a bit of a red herring really in some respects. And I think what we need to do now is we need to do a detailed survey on swimming in terms of schools to understand actually what the picture is across the county, because I think we've got some intelligence, but we haven't got a complete picture of school swimming, and I think we need that. We've obviously done kind of isolated bits of work through HAF in terms of doing some intensive swimming, which has worked really well. We're also through the Opening Schools Facilities funding that we've had, we're working with a local pool in Wiveliscombe and Kingsmead, the school there, in order to do some dedicated work around swimming. So there are isolated opportunities, but I think what we need to understand is how big is this problem before we can actually then look at what are the solutions, because we have got some solutions. I think it's about then rolling that out so that everyone can access that.
Yeah, I do. I'd say completely understand that, and a lot of the things certainly, because we've been talking about swimming not only in my school role but equally through the sort of business as well, and the new Speedo initiative with the pools for school and stuff like that obviously coming out, and I know they're up north. I don't know if it's reached down here yet, which again some different opportunities in that one. But the main issue they got, obviously the actual cost of the pool is not too bad. It's the transport to the pool is the problem, and then cancellation by the pools for various things, which obviously don't help to it. And when they're only swimming for 20 minutes out of a 30-minute session, it's pointless, and they're wasting potentially 2 hours doing it. And that's why they're cutting down on certainly the ones I'm speaking to. Now, I think I've had a conversation with about 15, 20 schools at the moment around this, but that's just one element. The other elements are stuff happening outside the school that's obviously too pricey at the moment for people to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I wouldn't disagree with you, John, but I think there are solutions out there that we can have through the funding that we've got. So I don't know what particular school you're from or what your role is, but certainly reach out to us through one of the SGOs or anyone within SASP, and we can certainly look to work with you on that, because ultimately what we've done with some of the HAP and the intensive swimming, because I think ultimately this is about targeting the right children. There are children that can't afford to do swimming outside of the school environment, and it's those children that we need to be targeting, not your children who are already in a learn to swim program and are already swimming you know, on a weekly basis all year round. That's not the children that we want. We need to be reaching those that aren't swimming.
No, I completely agree on that one. And the same with the school. The school process is the school has to take the kids swimming to do it, even though some of them are in elite squads, so that they can do it anyway. So they're actually thinking outside the box and not taking these kids now and housing them back in school. But equally, it's opportunities out there and what they can do, as you mentioned, Jake.
Yeah. So I would say we're on it, and we're happy to work with anyone who's on this call or all schools. But I think we just need that robust evidence base first of all. So that's going to be our first sort of port of call, really.
Thanks, Jake and John. Does anyone have any final thoughts or questions before we finish? No? Well, thanks everyone for joining. I've recorded this and I will put it on our website and share the link afterwards and share the slides as well. And if you do have any thoughts or questions in the meantime, feel free to get in touch with me. More than happy to talk through in more detail. But yeah, thank you everyone.
Bye.
Okay, thanks for that.